Now, it's not build the wall, it's finish the wall, finish the wall, finish the wall, finish the wall, finish the wall.
Now, you really mean finish that wall, because we built a lot of it.
And there, the branding experience continues. President Trump and his political team plan to make his quest for a border wall one of the central themes of his re-election effort. Bob Costa, you and your colleagues report in the Washington Post that the president's recent national emergency declaration has, quote, galvanized many of his supporters, even as others on the right remain dubious and disappointed. You say he's essentially trying to speak the wall into existence. I would agree with that. I think this is all about branding, and he's going to actually change the message before our eyes.
And for Trump insiders, it's necessary branding at this moment, looking ahead to the Mueller report on the horizon, to all of the political challenges on Capitol Hill. They thought in 2018, immigration in the caravan, that was the way to stoke their core voter. And in 2020, they believe they have to underscore that the president is not moving away from his commitment to a border wall, even as Congress balks at sending any kind of significant funding to that project. Politically, it remains at the center of what this presidency is all about.
All right, let's bring in national security reporter for NBC News, Julia Ainsley, with the latest on the newest legal challenges to President Trump's national emergency declaration. He did predict there would be challenges. He had that whole sing-song thing. So is this step one in it?
Yeah, so we've already seen a number of legal challenges just come out over the weekend. Yesterday, 16 states filed in the Northern District of California. And I've got some reporting that soon there will be a declaration that will be used as part of one of those lawsuits from 50 former national security and homeland security officials, bipartisan, mainly those who worked in Democratic administrations, but some Republican administrations, who will say that this is not a national emergency. And they back it up, some with NBC reporting, saying there is no known terrorism at the border. There is no human trafficking drug problem that can be fixed with a wall. They say that this also undermines national security and foreign policy, because you're circumventing the process of Congress and in terms of internationally, what it looks like for the United States to have a leader that circumvents our normal process to build a wall on this border. So we should be hearing from that soon. That'll be a declaration that's part of these lawsuits that they think will be used.
Mike.
Robert Costa, the emergency resolution, the President of the United States, what role, if any, did the White House counsel play in this whole deal?
The White House counsel is now Pat Cipollone. He replaced Don McGahn. He was hesitant about this national emergency declaration based on my conversations with White House officials, but he was not someone putting his hand up trying to stop it and yank it from happening. Pat Cipollone, along with Acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, came around to the idea that the president does have, in their eyes, this executive power, and they also knew, as they observed him in the West Wing, that he was politically cornered, and they saw this as a political out. But Pat Cipollone and the Department of Justice may have a lot to defend here as this heads to the courts and it's challenged by other states.
All right. Well, and then looking, what are the lawsuits that can actually get somewhere?
So that's a good question.
What are the ones that could be most successful?
It really depends on the class. So these are class action lawsuits. You have to show that your class was damaged. So it's really different than the conversation we have here about whether or not this is a national emergency and the powers the president can use. They need to show that someone was hurt. And if you think about the lawsuit that was most successful in challenging Obama's expansion of DACA, that was Texas showing that it was hurt by having to pay for the driver's license of immigrants. So sometimes it's not what we would think. It has to be a class. So it could be landowners in Texas. It could be environmental groups. And it could be states arguing that their taxpayers are unfairly burdened by this. But it may be not a place that we would necessarily go to look.
So proving, that someone was hurt, but also how much we all seize upon this. How important is it that the president himself said to the American people, for everyone to hear, I didn't need to do this.
I think that is important, right? If you're going to use that as your reason that it's an emergency is something that has to be taken care of now.
Proving himself that he is using a power that he has inappropriately,
yes,
in order to get something that he wants politically.
Right, and I actually even think the expediency doesn't make a fair argument, because he said that it's going to go through all of these courts. That could be a 2-year process by the time it actually goes to the Supreme Court. Arguably, he could have gotten that faster if he had gone through Congress.
And what's going to happen?
Go ahead,
What's going to
Robert.
happen? What's going to happen when the Democrats win the White House? This is what conservatives are telling me on Capitol Hill, and they say, well, climate change is a national emergency, Republican Party, and we're going to declare a national emergency on climate change, and the Green New Deal is the solution. What's the Republican argument at that point?
Julia, anybody have it? Because I don't think there's anything they can say. Tom?
I think the Republicans are entirely in a short-term game. They don't care about what happens 2 years from now. I think they're in complete survival mode at this point. But I did have one question, and that is, Julia, for the White House staff, is there any sense when they're asked about this where the president keeps jumping back and forth between, the wall's already built, it's not really built. President, there's that transcript we saw today with the president of Mexico, Peña Nieto, who says we're never paying for the wall, and Trump says, okay, just don't say it out loud. Does this have any impact? It almost seems like they just kind of wish cast it away every time the president speaks. And I mean, somebody ends up having to deal with that stuff.
And I think sometimes they give the president talking points that he ignores, and it could be the last thing that he remembers in his mind when he goes out to deliver this. But I do know that there were some people leading up to this who said they hoped that cooler heads would prevail. They gave him a range of options. I know there were many drafts of this speech. And then he didn't even use the teleprompter, so I don't know where those drafts went. But there were other options. You could see that they wanted to do more executive action than national emergency, and they could have gotten a fair amount of funding just on the executive action. But this pushes them into a new territory. So clearly those cooler heads did not prevail.
Yamiche, jump in.
I have a question about the sourcing of the president's data for declaring this national emergency.
Yes.
I was in the Rose Garden when reporters were pressing him, saying your own government data says that there isn't a national emergency and there isn't a crisis because border apprehensions are down. Drugs are going through legal ports of entry. When the president gets to court or the White House counsel gets to court, would you have any idea, Julia, what their data is going to be? Where are they going to pull this from?
That's a great question, Yamiche. I mean, I think that what they would look at is that the numbers are up from when Trump first came into office, because there was a big dip, a lot of it having to do with his rhetoric. The numbers went down in 2017. And now we're seeing, as far as border apprehensions, the numbers are about where they were under Obama, but they're still not where they were in 14 or 16, and they're not anywhere near where they were in 2000. The other thing I don't know how they will argue is the fact that the numbers are up because of asylum seekers, people who are coming legally to our ports of entry, and if you build a wall, that does nothing for them. There are thousands of people waiting in Tijuana just to come here and make a claim.
Julia Ainsley and Robert Costa, thank you both for being on this morning. And still ahead, investigators in North Carolina say they found evidence of ballot fraud in a congressional midterm race that is still unresolved. We'll go live to Raleigh for the latest next on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.